Hi, this is David Heine, Aspect Art. Thank you for joining us. Today we're at the Jewish Historical Society for the Jozef Israëls show. With us today is the curator, Edward van Voolen, who's going to tell us about the influences of Jozef Israëls. Now, he was born in Groningen and grew up in a traditional Jewish family. He traveled and was much influenced by the Barbizon school. His paintings were sometimes compared with the Rembrandts of the 17th century. Jozef Israëls was a popular painter even in his time. Today, as the attendance of these shows indicates, he's still a popular painter. So join us now for Jozef Israëls at the Jewish Historical Museum. Jozef Israëls came originally from Groningen. Was there a large Jewish population there, and did he grow up in a kind of a traditional Jewish background?
Jozef Israëls was born in Groningen in 1824, and he grew up in quite a thriving Jewish community. At that time, about 700 or 800 families were member there. There was a synagogue, there was a rabbi, and there were teachers. And Jozef Israëls got a traditional Jewish upbringing. His parents lived at home according to the Jewish dietary laws. They went to synagogue. His father laid phylacteries in the morning. So it was quite traditional. And Jozef Israëls became bar mitzvah. So that's at the age of 13. For the first time he was called up in the synagogue. And he learned this Hebrew portion of the Bible so well that he could recite it later in his life.
Now, was it oh no, you want to be a painter kind of thing? Or did they accept him as a painter, and did he have this desire from an early age?
It was quite to the contrary. The reaction was not, oh no, do you want to become a painter? The reaction was, oh no, do you want to become a rabbi? Because he was so good in his Hebrew and his Jewish knowledge, and he was so enthusiastic about it, that indeed there was a chance that he would have become a rabbi. But his talents for painting and for the arts was already so developed at early age, in his teens, that indeed he decided to become a painter, and his parents stimulated him. It was no problem at home.
Now, he went from his early training in Groningen to, he traveled some after that, didn't he? Where did he get most of his formal training?
His formal training he got, except for Groningen, in Amsterdam. And as a student he went to Paris, and there he was exposed to the arts, to new movements in French art, the new interest in the scenes from peasants, which really impressed him very much, his history painting, which he saw in France and in Amsterdam as well. And he became established at a young age in Amsterdam as a painter. He had to struggle hard in the beginning, but his successes came in his early 30s.
Now, much of his painting is formed by a kind of appreciation of the peasantry, maybe from exposure, as you say, to Méliès or the Barbizon school of paintings. Did this formulate some of his early painting influences?
Yes, it does indeed. His interest in the life of peasants and his interest in fishermen's scenes. He was one of the earliest to express that in his paintings. And in his formative years and long after, he was very involved in those themes indeed.
Now, eventually he came to move to The Hague, I believe. What there was his calling, if you will, about in painting, and what was his influences in The Hague?
In the 1870s, the early 1870s, he went to The Hague. At that time, a more exciting place for painters to go to, and the attraction of The Hague was that he was near the coast and could observe the fishers there. And that was the reason for moving to The Hague.
Now, in The Hague, there was a particular school of painting called the Hague School, with Mesdag and Maris. And was he a member of this?
He was a member of that. He knew his colleagues very well. Mesdag he knew already from Groningen. And he was very respected within that school. Was one of the most successful painters in that school, together with Mesdag and Maris. And later on, in the 90s, his paintings were among the best sold and the highest prized paintings of the school. It's very interesting to observe that Jozef Israëls became recognized already quite early, in the 60s and in the 70s, not only in the Netherlands, but also abroad. So investors, people who were collecting art, and museums were buying his work already early on. So that makes the Jozef Israëls exhibition, both in The Hague, both the fact that he was collected by private collectors and by museums already quite early on made it very exciting to organize a Jozef Israëls exhibition, both in Groningen and in Amsterdam, because works had to be gathered from all over the world.
I was surprised that they came from so many different collections, from the National Museum in London to Israel, many of them. Now, speaking of Israel, throughout his life he continued to paint Hebrew scenes, or scenes from the Bible, scenes that were from the Jewish community. Was this an ongoing thing that he painted throughout his life?
On the contrary, the Jewish scenes were popped up rather late in his life, as if to say that once he had become a successful painter, he devoted some time to Jewish themes. They are rather limited in his total oeuvre. There are only 3 or 4 of them: the Son of the Ancient Race, the Jewish Wedding, and his self-portrait before Saul and David. And then we have some biblical scenes from the Old Testament early on in his life and later on in his life. And throughout his life he painted family members, Jewish acquaintances, and famous Jews from his time. So it is in his total oeuvre a small part, but a very important part, because the Son of the Ancient Race became immediately famous, and his Jewish Wedding was immediately bought, and those 2 paintings became, together with the Torah scribe, which is not on view, icons for Jozef Israëls.
Now, Jozef Israëls was often compared with Rembrandt. Why was that?
That has to do with his dark tones and with his subjects. The comparison was certainly one that Jozef Israëls himself liked and catered to also. His Jewish Wedding, his painting Jewish Wedding, is definitely in the same genre as the Rembrandt painting, with the same theme. And his Saul and David, his large painting, is also inspired by a theme by which Rembrandt had become famous. So he liked the comparison. He liked to be called the Rembrandt of the 19th century.
Now, when I was in Groningen looking at the exhibition, I saw a number of paintings that reminded me also of Van Gogh, some of his aardappel eaters. Was there any contact between Israëls and Van Gogh?
There was no direct contact between Jozef Israëls and Vincent van Gogh, but Jozef Israëls belonged to the painters who had made scenes of potato eaters first. And we know that Van Gogh himself was an admirer of Jozef Israëls precisely for that reason. He mentions Israëls a couple of times in his letters to his brother.
I was told by John Layton that he may have visited Mesdag at one point, or at least been aware of his collection. And he always liked Millet. Was Israëls influenced by his contemporaries in The Hague, or did he influence them?
Israëls was both influenced by his contemporaries and he influenced them. That is to say, for the 70s and the 80s, that's correct. Later on, he became a little bit an old-fashioned painter. Jozef Israëls had, as art historians are sometimes saying, the disadvantage of becoming very old. So by the time he was in his late 70s and 80s, he was really old-fashioned. So then you had already Van Gogh and you had already pointillism and impressionism, and so many other movements were already around, even early abstraction. And Jozef Israëls became old-fashioned at that time. But the interesting thing is that he remained popular with collectors, and particularly with Jewish collectors. And that was the case since a Jewish Renaissance around the 1900s, a sort of a national cultural revival, which led in its political form to the establishment of the State of Israel. But meantime, all through the 20th century, his works were collected by Jewish collectors because they were proud of him as a Jewish painter, despite the fact that the number of Jewish paintings of Jozef Israëls is limited to 4 or 5 themes.
Thank you very much for being with us today, Edward.
It was a pleasure.
Hello, this is David Heine, and today we're in Hoorn, a small, beautiful village just a little outside of Amsterdam. We're at the Westfries Museum, which is a very unique and probably overlooked museum. With us today is the curator, Carl de Jong. Carl, I'd like to ask you, first of all, a little about the building in which the museum itself is housed.
Yes, it's a kind of provincial office building. The representatives of the 7 cities in the north of Holland met each other here in a kind of sphere that when they came to the States General in Den Haag, they could make a bloc together, a political bloc against the behavior of Amsterdam. So it's a kind of political combination against Amsterdam. As you can imagine, Amsterdam was the most powerful political and economical center in the Netherlands, and the West Frisians felt that they had spent together against Amsterdam.
Now downstairs, the museum is organized actually by floors in some ways. Could you describe the organization here?
Yes. We tell something about the history of Hoorn and West Friesland in particular. But the nice thing about it is that it goes along with the Dutch history. When you talk about Dutch history, you can see it in this museum, because the history of Hoorn goes equivalent. When you talk about coming up of the market, Asian or American trade, it was there in Hoorn. And when it fell down in the 18th century, it fell deeper in Hoorn, of course. But that the common rule of Dutch history, you can see it in this museum. That's the nice thing about it. Problem, of course, is then that only the objects of the rich have remained. We can only tell a part of society. We can only tell about behavior of just a small group of people. That's our problem.
Now, on the first floor, it's a kind of meeting ground you were describing earlier. Could you describe that room for us?
Yes, it's a room where we put the paintings of the civic art. That's why it's most of the one of the most representative rooms in the museum. But the civic art was more than just a group of men defending the city. It was also a political power within the city, and they thought of themselves that they brought the peace of Munster in 1648. And that's why the paintings were made, because they wanted to show off. Here we are. You can see the paintings for yourself. They say, here we are the most important political power in the city. They are not the regenten, we are middle class. And that's always a kind of struggle in 17th and 18th century cities in Holland. A big difference with other European countries is that political power in other political countries lies within the noblemen, upper class. In Holland, it is in the cities. And the political struggle goes between groups of people within the cities. And they show off.
Now, you were describing a type of government that developed out of Holland, maybe the forerunner to the American democracy, as we know. Could you describe that a little bit?
Yes. Every man who paid a certain amount of taxes had the right to vote. Every man who had to pay a certain amount of higher taxes had the right to be voted. So it had to do with money. But in strategy, it was democratic. You can't decide about the money if you don't pay with it. That was the idea behind it. But it was, in principle, democratic. There was only one problem, and that is the church. The church, of course, had in the 17th century that kind of influence that they said, no, only members of the state church can vote. And that's why the Catholics or the Baptist people or whatever were secluded from the elections. Later on, the jobs, regenten jobs, were divided within families because they could buy the middle class, or upper class could buy middle class. For example, if you are a governor in the East Indian Company, then you can give an order to a bakery to bake for 150 men for 2 years to take bread on the ship. Yeah, it could be possible. You make of that man a rich man. He has the right to vote. On who will he vote? On you. So there is a client system. You make people depend on you. And that's how this political struggle became more intensive within the ranks of the people.
You spoke of the Dutch, or the VOC, Dutch East Indies Company. We're sitting in the room that you've dedicated to the VOC. Could you describe this room for us a little bit?
Yes.
And some of the tableaus?
Yes, of course. Let me start with the beginning of the VOC, because that, for the history of the city, it's very important. Because Hoorn took part in it. When the way to Indonesia was found, Dutch ships went there. And when in 1602 the VOC was founded, there also came a chamber in Hoorn. And from that point on, the VOC was the most important company or institution in Hoorn until 1795. For almost 200 years, it had its impression on the city. That's why some objects, many objects, have remained, and that's why we can make a beautiful room like this in our museum. And well, the story is that we tell something about the VOC in Holland, in Hoorn, about the sailors, about the institution itself, and about the Asiatic products and the influence on the house decoration. That's what we try to tell here in some parts. It's very particular, some parts it's very broad.
You're able here to depict some of the common men, the sailors that took place, and as well as the wealthy merchants. Could you describe the differential between these two classes?
Yeah, of course. The best example is, for example, when they went to sea. Of course, on a ship there is a ranking. The rules are very strict. When on a small ship like that, you know perhaps the ship the Batavia or the ship Amsterdam, very small ships to standards of today. There are more than 200 men on that ship, so the rules had to be very strict. And every man was allowed to take one crate to put his things in. But of course the captain or the referent was allowed to take a large crate, the sailor a small one. That's the difference between high and low ranking. And in society, of course, it is the same. There were not very many poor people in a city like Hoorn. Of course, there were some years that everybody was poor because of the prices of the grain. But not many people died of hunger. There's a big difference in the kind of houses they lived in. And I told you already that the problem of our museum, of course, is that you can tell many stories about rich people, but about normal people, their object did not remain. They used it until it was broken and then it was thrown away. And when you're lucky, you'll find it back by archaeological research, and then you can show it in other contexts, but not as a part of the living of poor people. That's why we try to tell a coherent story. We try to tell the story of the common man, but in relation to the objects in our museum. It's not always easy, but we try to do it.
You were speaking of style. Now, style developed as the VOC went out to these exotic lands and brought things back. How did it change the rather plain and somewhat staid Holland town of Hoorn?
If you earn a lot of money, you want to spend it. You want to show off. We all want to drive a Mercedes instead of a Lada. That's what it is. And it has always been like that. I think people are like that. So when beautiful cotton comes from India with fabulous colors, you want to wear it. When there is special silk from China, you want to make a dress of it. When there comes Chinaware, porcelain, from China or Japan, you want to show it off in your room. That's how it influenced Dutch interiors and the Dutch fashion. On the back where we sit, there's a painting of a man wearing a Japanese skirt. We would say kimono nowadays, but they call it Japanese skirt. And he is showing off. He shows, well, I'm one of the richest men in town. Look how progressive in fashion I am. That's how they behaved during of the development of the East Indian Company.
Each of these tableaus that you've created seem to depict stories. What is this fellow over at the desk doing?
Yes, he is a member of the board, and he is looking for new material to study. They study. The VOC was an enormous stimulans, is that a good word? Stimulans for development of science. For example, the description of plants, animals, men living in other countries. And that kind of science must be written down. And that's what he is doing. That's why all those books are there. That's why he has a small case of Indonesian spices within him to describe them and to tell something about the voyage to Indonesia and to tell something about the way you should use pepper not only as a maker of taste but also as a medicine, for example.
I've noticed that in some of your display cases you have what they were trading in primarily. What was the VOC mostly trading in?
No, at first they were just going there for spices. That was important. You could make money in there. But when they came there, they noticed that there was a lot more. The Asian cultures were so high that they could not use trade from us. There was nothing, almost nothing, they could use what we brought there. So you had to pay in silver. Silver is expensive. So Jan Pieter Koen, born in Hoorn, set up an international trade line where the spices in Indonesia were paid by cottons from India. And the cottons from India were paid by coffee from Yemen. The coffee from Yemen was paid by gold from Japan. And the gold from Japan was paid by silk from China. And the silk from China were paid by spices from Indonesia. And that's how they traveled along Asia. That's why they always used 20 until 40 ships there. That's why they needed a central place, Batavia, nowadays Jakarta. That's why they always needed 10 to 20,000 men living there. Jan Pieter Koen did not advantage colonialism. It was much too expensive. Then you need soldiers. Then you need Marines. Now he said, we just go and live there, defend the place where we live, but from then on we'll have a strategy so that the Maharaja in India or the Shogun in Japan will trade with us, not with our competitors. That's the international trade that's set up. And that's why the VOC is called nowadays as the first multinational.
As a multinational, they also brought a lot of information back to Europe, didn't they? And weren't they at one point the Dutch language used as a scientific language?
Sometimes, for example, in Japan, because for 150 until 200 years, the Dutch were the mirror to the rest of the world. The only language the Japanese scientists had a relation to was the Dutch language. So when there were scientific papers in medicine science, they wrote it in Dutch, because then it could be controlled by the Dutch medicine scientists and so on. Until early in the 20th century, these articles were written in Dutch. But in other cases, the Dutch learned the language of the place there. When they went to China, they learned Chinese. When they went to India, they learned Sanskrit. It's a different kind of position for each country you were living in.
Dutch rarely seemed to build churches out there in the colonies. Maybe it had to do somewhat with the VOC dictate of not colonizing. They were primarily there for trade, huh?
Yeah, I think it's cheaper to use the church of somebody already built. Why should you build a church if there is already one there? So what they did was they took over the most Portuguese settlements. And when there's a Catholic church, you fetch off the statues and you use it as in the Protestant church. It's quite easy, it costs nothing. That's the reason. They went there, they lived there, and they had a church. Or it was quite cheap, you took it over from the Portuguese.
There are a lot of objects other than just the paintings here.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little description of some of the prizes of your collection as you would see them?
Most important in this room are the objects that they brought back from Asia, of course. We show some spices, we show some other stuff. For example, in a rariteitenkabinet, that's a case full of strange things. Yes, it's quite interesting, because in the early 17th century, people became rich. And when you become rich, you want to spend your money. Another example of what I told you just before. When you are rich, you want to look important. So when a ship came back from Indonesia, you go to a sailor and you said, "Do you have some souvenirs?" "Yes, I have some shells from the Isle of Ambon." "Give it to me, I'll buy it from you." You put it in a small case, and when people come to you, you say, "Look what I've got, the feathers of a paradise bird. I've got the shells from Ambon. I've got Chinese porcelain." It gives you a suggestion of importance that you really don't have. You're just sitting here in the city and do some trade work, but it looks as if you were there yourself. These collections became bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's why the trade also developed. The ships went not only to Indonesia, but went to China to fetch some porcelain, of course. Why? They knew in Holland there were people to buy it. Well, the other important things are from the East Indian Company itself. The objects that remained of the company. It tells us something about the company, how they worked, what kinds of ships they had, what kind of sailors they had, how they traveled, how they had their institutions in the city. That is also important, of course. And then, of course, the objects of the people. Not only the governors or members of the board, but also from the sailors. Sometimes also their objects remained. And it's quite interesting to see that on every object belonging to the VOC, there was their logo. When you buy a Philips television set, it says Philips. When you have something of the VOC, it says VOC. More than 400, of almost 400 years ago, they already did it. On every object belonging to them, they had their logo on it. It's very nice.
We think of Hoorn as a somewhat small city or town outside of Amsterdam now, but in the 17th century it must have been a teeming place. How exactly was Hoorn in the late 17th or 18th century?
Yeah, that's nice. I always say in 1650, Hoorn was bigger than or larger than in 1950. Hoorn in 1650 had 22,000 inhabitants. In 1950 it had only 15,000 inhabitants. And only by the settlement of many people from Amsterdam here, Hoorn grew, became larger and larger. But Hoorn was the seventh city in the 17th century in the way of inhabitants, but the importance in trade was the second or the third place. Amsterdam, of course, was the most important city, but Hoorn was the most important city on the Zuiderzee, and Middelburg in Zeeland. They were the three important trade cities.
How many ships would you say populated the small harbor at that point?
In the early 17th century were more than 300 or 400 ships. And imagine that every ship had a crew of 40 men. And then I'm talking about ships going to the Mediterranean or ships going to the Baltic. So 400 ships of 40 men, 16,000 people. Where did they come from? In the city couldn't bring those men. So they came from the villages in the neighborhood, or they came from Germany or Scandinavia just to work here on the ships. It was a large harbor. There was no sea in the world where ships from Hoorn didn't come. It was an international port. Not like Rotterdam nowadays, but perhaps like Antwerp nowadays. It was important. The problem was that the backyard of Hoorn is not as big as the backyard of Amsterdam. Behind Amsterdam there are big cities like Utrecht or Leiden or Haarlem. Hoorn has cows. There was nothing to sell, almost nothing to sell. So during the 17th century, ships went to Amsterdam to sell their cargo on the auctions there instead of in Hoorn. And that was the beginning of the centralization of the market in Amsterdam. And that's why shipping in Hoorn declined. It's one of the most important reasons.
With all that population teeming into Hoorn from all over the country, there must have been some discipline problems here. I noticed upstairs you have a tableau of a jail and a few punishment implements. Was that a problem?
Not really. Of course, there is always a problem with sailors coming home, getting drunk and so on. There's always a problem, of course. But the rules were very strict. For example, the Germans and Scandinavians who came to the city were received at the city gate by some people knowing as innkeepers. They said, "Welcome to the city of Hoorn. Would you like to have a place to rest?" "Well, please, sir. Do you have money to pay it?" No, I'm sorry, I don't have. Would you like to have some money? "Well, you're very kind, but can you pay the money back?" "No." "Do you have a job?" "No, I don't have a job." "Would you like me to give you a job?" "Yeah, it would be very nice, sir." well, sign here, then you'll have a job for 5 years. People signed, put a cross on a list, and they signed off for the VOC and went off for 5 years. That's how it went. So they were framed. And from that moment on, they were restricted. They couldn't do the things they wanted anymore. They were a member of the VOC organization and were very strict. So this chaos was not there. It was very strict. Rules were harsh.